All right, everyone, we're about to get started again, so please, if you're not in your seat, take your seat. All right.
Okay, good.
And how do you turn this on?
It's on. You just talk.
Is this on? No.
Pull it towards you.
Hello? Yes.
Okay.
My name is Lani Guinier. I'm a professor here at Harvard Law School, and I am honored to be asked to introduce to you, although he certainly needs much less of an introduction than I do, a friend and a colleague, Gerald Torres, who's going to speak to you as part of a question and answer. I'm the question, he's the answer. On issues of environmental justice. And I can't think of a person better than Gerald to be educating you, or at least sharing with you some of the experiences that he's had, since he's not only a leading figure in environmental law, but also in federal Indian law and in critical race theory. He's currently a professor at Cornell University Law School, and for the two prior decades, he was the Brian Smith Chair in Law at the University of Texas School of Law. Prior to teaching at UT, he taught at the University of Minnesota Law School, where he served as an associate dean, and he's also the former president of the Association of American Law Schools, AALS. He has served, and this is actually quite relevant to one of the first questions I'm going to ask him. He served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the United States Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. And he also served as counsel to then U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno. He and I have written a book, The Miner's Canary: Enlisting Race, Resisting Power, Transforming Democracy, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2002, and which was described by Publishers Weekly as, quote, one of the most provocative and challenging books on race produced in years. Gerald Torres has many other articles, including Translation and Stories, which was published in the Harvard Law Review, Who Owns the Sky? That was published in the Pace Law Review in 2001. And I could go on, but I'll end with Translating Your Nundio by Precedent and Evidence, the Mashpee Indian Case, in the Duke Law Journal. He served on the board of the Environmental Law Institute, the National Petroleum Council. The National Petroleum Council.
Remind me to tell you who the chairman of that was.
And on EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. He's also vice chair of Earth Day Network and board chair and founding chair of the Advancement Project, aka AP, which fights for economic and racial justice and for a just democracy. He graduated from Stanford University in 1974. He got his JD from Yale Law School in 1977, and then he got an LLM degree from the University of Michigan Law School in 1980. He just came back from teaching a 2-week intensive course on critical race theory and social movements, and he gave several very excellent talks to the faculty. And one of the faculty members at UVA said, quote, Gerald is the nicest person I met and the only person who gave me genuine advice when the faculty member was on the job market. So he's also a nice guy, in other words. Do you want to introduce any more of yourself? Or should I go to the first question? Oh, and I should also introduce myself.
I could do that.
Oh, okay, you introduce me.
This is Lani Guinier.
Okay, we'll work with that. Now, the interesting thing is Gerald and I were both nominated for a position at the Department of Justice at the same time in 1993. I did not get the job. So one of the questions that I'm going to ask him has to do with the Department of Justice, because he got the job, or at least a version of the job, and was very instrumental in getting the executive order that the Department of Justice then enacted.
The president.
What? And the president, but in particular the Department of Justice, which is where Gerald was. Okay, so I guess my first question for you, Gerald, is why and when did environmental justice become an issue for the Department of Justice?
Since you've already gone through the history, presumably, of environmental justice, I don't need to recapitulate that. But one of the important things that happened was during the transition, the section of the transition team that was focused on the Department of Justice and EPA had an environmental justice element in it, so that when the president assumed office and the attorney general assumed her position, one of the first issues, one of the issues that was particularly salient, was developing a response to the grassroots pressure that was felt long before the president was ever elected, and even long before the transition team started to put the pieces in place. What we were directed to do was to draft the executive order, obviously, and then enter into a long interagency process, and I can talk about that as well. But one of it would not have come to the place on the agenda that it came to without the pressure of community groups and grassroots people that built all of that time. It wasn't like it came out of the head of the Attorney General or any or the President or anybody. It would not have been an issue but for people making it an issue. And there was like a 20-year period, right, between the time it became an issue and the time it actually matured into a policy initiative. And you need to, I think, remember that. But it was the people who pushed it. The community groups.
And how would you explain to this audience what the process was through the Department of Justice to get the environmental justice issue taken seriously?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. One is, as people in this audience obviously know, that it were people who were involved in the EJ movement who both elevated the issue and started to outline what the structure of the issues ought to be. One of the things that's important, right, and I think Robert is going to talk about this later, right, is that it's important to remember that the EJ community linked environmental justice to the health of the communities in important ways, and so the health became one of the defining characteristics. But what I wanted to do, and actually what I got to do, was to say, the brains of the operations is out there. The brains of the operation is among the people who have been promoted. So I'm sure much to, you couldn't, I'm not even sure you could do this given the level of security now getting into federal buildings. But what we did then was over a multi-week period is we had people, community people from various environmental justice groups around the country come into the Department of Justice. And we sat in a room and we asked them to give presentations and we talked to them and we took notes. And a couple of things became clear. One thing that became clear is that there was a lot more stuff going on out in the community than is commonly given credit for. That's one. Second, there was a cross-racial dimension that was basically class-based that was out there across various environmental justice groups. that there were specific kinds of issues that depended upon where the community groups are coming from that all came to a focus. And it wasn't just the conventional environmental groups that would have to be implicated in the change, right? It had to be every federal agency that was making a decision that affected the environment, that affected the quality of the health of those groups who are out there. And so we had, I want to say, 200 people in, right, over the course of several weeks, just to talk to us, so that we could, you know, we weren't going to write the executive order and say this is what it is. We wanted for it to reflect the issues of the people out there. So, I mean, if I can put a footnote, right, in some ways, Janet Reno was really central to that, right? Because her view was, and maybe it's because she's a politician, right? But her view was that you needed to listen to the people that were going to be affected by what the department did, and then unless you listened to them, you weren't going to get it right. And I'm not going to say we got it right, but we at least listened, and it was reflected in her approach. If I can, it's not exactly environmental justice, but her approach to Indian policy, right? Because she was the one that initiated something that now the federal government does routinely, and she initiated something that was called the National American Indian Listening Conference. And typically, when the administration takes over, the Department of Interior invites the tribes in, and they talk to the tribes. And she said, you know, actually, we ought to do it differently. What we ought to do is that the tribes ought to run it, and the federal government ought to be the audience. And so she created the first listening conference out in Albuquerque, run by the tribes, and the audience were every federal officer who had work in Indian country. So it was a version of that kind of ethos, I think, that went into also trying to figure out what the executive order should be.
Now, could you remind us how the executive order was supposed to work?
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's important to remember what the executive order was supposed to be, right? The executive order, right? How many of you have read the executive order? More than I imagined would raise your hands. Right? Well, that's a good thing, right? Right. But when you read the executive order, you get to the bottom of it. What's the last line of the executive order? Right. Exactly. Right. So it's basically designed to be an internal housekeeping mechanism. Okay. So it basically is directed to the agencies. Right, and so one of the things that came out of it was an interagency task force that would then require each of the agencies to develop their own environmental justice strategy. And you want to know where, there's a lot, all of you have done any government work or worked in any complex organization, or in any organization, complex or not, right, recognize that there's a lot of ways to slow stuff down, right? There's a lot, I mean, like when this memo gets off my desk, right, becomes like something that's not immediately reviewable and not immediately noticeable, right? But within the agencies that wanted to resist they're masters at resisting. They're masters at resisting. I mean, anybody who's done civil rights work knows that they're masters at resisting. So the way the executive order was designed to work was an interagency task force, I was vice chair of that, was designed to try to push through environmental justice strategies in each agency. And that, I think it finally got done. I left before it got done. But that's the way it was supposed to work. The idea was, here's the executive order. This is directed to the agencies. The agencies have to make an assessment of their own decision-making processes consistent with the executive order, and they have to reform their internal governing mechanisms so that the decisions they make support the values and the efforts that are the goals that are defined in the executive order. That was the idea. And so, you have every agency, right? And what do you suppose the first thing that happened when the executive order was issued? I'm sure it still happens today. Right? It's all the independent agencies sent memos to the Department of Justice saying, this doesn't apply to us. Right? This doesn't apply to us. So you have to start then making distinctions between the different kinds of administrative agencies. And then you have to try to figure out a way to get those people who are going to resist right at the beginning by saying this doesn't apply to us to comply. And so, it was hard, but that's the way it was. The idea was that you reform the internal mechanisms of the agencies. I mean, there's people here who have some experience with that, and maybe they'll talk about it. So that's you set out the normative standards in the executive order, and then it's all done through process.
Is there anything else you want to say about the work you did at DOJ before we move on to the work that you're doing as a law professor?
Yeah, no, I think a couple of things. One is obviously the first agency that the executive order had to apply to was the Department of Justice, right? And so one of the questions was, how is the enforcement division, enforcement section in the Environment Division going to interpret the requirements of the executive order? And so one of the things, let me give you an example. When I was in the Department of Justice, there had been 12 safe drinking water enforcement acts undertaken in the entire history of the act. Okay? And so that's not a lot, by the way. And so if you're going to apply the executive order, one of the things you want to look at is what's the decision-making process that led to so few enforcement actions? One, what's the structure of the Safe Drinking Water Act that either impedes or allows those kinds of decisions to get made, right? And so you then had to go into the sections that are going to be enforcing this, and then you had to reach across to EPA, you had to reach across to the other departments that fund public drinking water systems, and you had to pull all those pieces together. So that's one thing you discover, is that it's incredibly fractured, and the Department of Justice itself had to get its own house in order. But importantly, the people doing the work had to know that the executive order was serious, right? Because if they thought that this was just something the president was, the president's going to draft this, he's going to sign it, he's going to do the memorandum, and then we can all go about our work, right? It wasn't going to happen, right? People know how to make stuff not happen, right? And the only way you get stuff to be taken seriously and to really make it happen is for people at the top to say, this really matters, right? For those of you who are law students here, I don't know, right? You take a question like diversity in law schools, right? People can say they claim to value diversity in law schools, but unless people at the very top take it seriously, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen, right? Changes that the people down through the administrative structure, right, the bureaucratic structure, have to know that they're being evaluated by how, because we all have incentive structures, right, that they're being evaluated by how their work corresponds to the stated and reinforced objectives that are coming from the top. And so that was a, I was just an academic, right? I mean, and I hadn't realized that you know, you get into politics. I was not a politician, right? You get into, some of y'all are, I presume, right? You get into politics, and you know, people play for keeps. You know, and it was the first place I guess I ever experienced the phenomenon of, some of you may have experienced this yourselves, right? Of people lying right to your face. Right? You know, I was sheltered. Yes, I felt sheltered. I felt really, you know, I mean, I didn't realize that I was combing the straw out of my hair, right, as I walked into the Department of Justice, right, or that I actually had fallen off a tomato truck, right, right. But you know, and so it was actually kind of shocking for someone to say, you know, today's Saturday. No, it's not. No. I'm pretty sure it's Saturday. You sure? I don't think it is. And you know, so suddenly you think, something's wrong here, right? And so that's why you need leadership, right, to really say, we want this to happen. And that was really critical. That's really, really, really critical. I was sheltered. Well, as my friend, I don't know if I should mention her name, Professor McKinnon says, right, academic freedom is the freedom to be academic. Right?
Okay, well, as an academic, can you tell us what the role is of environmental justice in relationship to other social justice and racial justice issues?
Yeah, no, one of the, a couple of things. One of the things that you can take out of the executive order, right, and I hope we can discuss this, is in order for the executive order to work, right, you have to know who's an environmental justice community. What are the elements that compose an environmental justice community, which means you've got to have some metrics for determining essentially how the actions of the state, of the government, are going to work, and how what impact they're going to have on the communities that you're trying to protect or represent or get into the process. And so a lot of the work gets done in the definitional section, right? And so what you want to do is you have to be both abstract and particular. And that's a difficult thing to do. So one of the things that the executive order did, for example, was to focus on cumulative effects, right? And you want to talk about health-based effects. When you talk about cumulative effects, you have to ask not just doing a cross-media analysis. That is, how are people impacted by pollution loads from various media, but how are communities differentially impacted, right? So that if you talk about what the toxic load for fish would be, for example, in a diet, well, if you're taking an abstract American, right, and ask what the toxic load of fish could be that would make consumption of fish safe, well, it's an entirely different question if you look at a cultural subgroup in the United States in which fish composes a larger part of the diet. Right, because if fish is going to be a larger part of the diet, then the pollution load that fish can carry to make them edible, right, is going to be substantially lower, right? So you have African Americans, actually poor African Americans, in some parts of the country consume a lot more fish than the quote average American. The Hmong in the California Delta, right? American Indian tribes, right? Some tribes have fish-based diets, right? So that one of the things it requires you to do is both identify what the hazard is, and then drill down and be really specific about what is the hazard these individual communities are going to, what burden are they going to carry, right? And so one of the things the environmental justice community did, right, was to both draw a frame around what the issues are and then require a more detailed, nuanced, and finer-grained analysis of the actual impacts of enforcement or non-enforcement decisions are having, but even before you get to enforcement decisions, of what the underlying standards are. And the underlying standards, obviously, with the things that trigger enforcement are, where the rubber meets the road in a lot of instances, especially for communities that are different from, quote, the norm. Sorry.
So I would like to hear from the audience if people in the audience have questions, but I'm giving you a 2-minute notice so you can write down your question or think about it, and I'll ask Professor Torres another question while you're thinking about what questions you want to ask. So how do you see the issues or the role of environmental justice working in relationship to other social justice or racial justice organizing, or not even organizing, but issues?
Well, my first job out of law school was with the Children's Defense Fund. And my first boss was a great woman named Marion Wright Edelman. And Marion Edelman, you come out of law school, you think, I'm going to be a lawyer, right? And Marion says, oh, that's fine, right? But when she sent us down to Mississippi to litigate, right, her rule was you litigate by day and you organize by night, right? So that you can't fly in from Washington, D.C., right, litigate this case, and then go back to Washington, D.C. and not leave an infrastructure. If you win, that's going to support that victory, right? So in Mississippi, the parents of the children who were my clients were sharecroppers, by and large, right? And it was my first, I have to say, it was my first encounter with the economic structure of sharecropping in the rural South. And so by organizing, by doing this was just children's rights stuff, right? By doing children's rights stuff, I, of course, had to meet the parents of these kids, and by meeting the parents of these kids, I then understood the environmental impacts of the way their life was lived, and how the environmental impacts of the way their life was lived was, in fact, having a deleterious effect on the children that we thought were our clients. So the environmental stuff, poverty, race, and class all came together in the process of organizing. And so I think that one of the things is you do environmental justice, and environmental justice, of course, is a window into the way the economic and social mechanisms work, and have all of these various other impacts on the communities that we claim to care about. I want to just drop a little footnote here, and I apologize for not doing this at the top, but I would like to dedicate this hour, however long we're going to have, to my teacher, Joe Sachs, who passed away 2 weeks ago. And he's basically I will meet objection with this, I apologize. In my view, he's basically the person who invented environmental law. And he's the person whose knee I sat at for 2 years to learn environmental law. And so I just wanted to honor him.
So we have time for some questions from the audience, and what I would like to do is to take the questions, and then Professor Torres can decide which ones of the questions he wants to answer or is prepared to answer. Yes, and tell me your name.
Sure, Fred Andes. Professor Torres, I know that you've written about critical race theory. Some of us many years ago at this law school learned about that from Professor Bell. But we didn't really talk about environmental issues in that class way back when. So I'm curious about how you would apply critical race theory in the context of environmental justice, which really wasn't a concept back in the 70s when Professor Bell was teaching it to us.
You want to take a bunch of questions first? Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the relationship between critical race theory and environmental justice. Yes. And what's your name?
Hi, I'm Melissa from NRDC. You're on our board, so I'm very pleased that you're here. My question is, in your opinion, what do you think the environmental justice movement is doing well today, And what are the areas in which you could improve?
Okay.
That may be one I don't choose to answer, but
At least not publicly.
over here.
This way. Oh, yes. Well,
My name is Hakeem. I just wanted to ask in relation to the environmental justice and obesity and mental health in the built environment, because I was doing a lot of research and I was seeing how the built environment impacts the mental health of culturally diverse populations and how obesity is directly connected with that. I just wanted to, if you could expound on that a little bit if possible.
okay, so the relationship between obesity and,
Obesity, the mental health, and the built environment.
okay. And you're Saul King. Your name is Saul King?
Oh, Hakeem.
Akeem? Okay, thank you. Yes.
My name's Jeannie, and I actually wanted to know, Professor Torres, if you would talk about why you put the, what I call disclaimer language into the executive order. Executive orders have been used since, not you, but all of you who worked on it, since President Washington. Every president has used executive orders, but that disclaimer language didn't show up, I think, until the Ford or Reagan eras. So I'd just like a little bit of the thought process that went through the decision to include it.
Okay, thank you, Jeannie. Yes?
I'm interested in...
Wait, what's your name?
Oh, James Williamson.
Thank you,
I'm
James.
interested in what is the National Petroleum Council and what is the nature of your work there?
Okay. Yes.
Amy Laura Khan, I'm a staff attorney with the Public Interest Law Center in Philadelphia. I'm interested if you have any thoughts on how we can better use human rights strategies, working for environmental justice, and also potentially constitutional amendments, thinking about the recent Robinson Township case in Pennsylvania.
Should we
Yes.
take any more or not?
What, this is,
In favor. So, since the executive order has been passed, there's been a number of studies that show that environmental justice around the country have intensified. Like even the National Law Journal looked at Superfund sites. Senator O'Neill did a study that showed that actually enforcement and racial disparities have worsened. So, I'd like to hear what you have to say about the limitations of the executive order itself. It's sort of a general crisis in environmental justice politics in general about how we overcome sort of the limitations that really haven't got us where we want to be, where we need to go.
okay. Wait, Joel Davidson, thank you.
Is there any mention of the idea of carbon footprint at this point and how that will fit into the
People
environment?
would push the button on that little thing in front of them and hold it.
Is there any mention of using the concept of carbon footprint and how that will apply to environmental justice? Does that issue ever come up?
Okay, I missed the first few.
Carbon footprint.
Carbon footprint, okay.
Carbon credits and so forth. I mean, that issue's come up in another context. Is that ever going to come up in this context?
Okay.
All right.
So do you want me to restate the questions, or have you decided which ones of these questions have you chosen to answer?
I'll try to, since we're supposed to end at like 2 or 2:15, when are we supposed to end? 2:15, okay, so even at 2:15, these will have to be brief answers. They're not going to be satisfactory to any of you. I apologize in advance. But I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. First of all, when I taught environmental law here at Harvard, it was actually in this room, right, and every seat was filled. So there was a lot of people interested in environmental law, but the intersection of critical race theory and environmental law had not yet been fully articulated. One of the things that critical race theory does, right, when you apply it to the environment, is it yields the environmental justice claims. And so that I would argue that some of the best work done in environmental justice really is now the work of critical race theory. I think part of it is that Professor Bell, didn't come out of an environmental background, and so it was not, he understood class, he understood poverty, he actually understood health issues, right? but in some ways they didn't see them as environmental issues, right? I think we're at a point now where it's impossible not to see a racial dimension, except in some national environmental groups, not to see an environmental dimension, racial dimension to environmental issues. You know, so that's one. I'll come back to the NRDC when I will answer it, right? It's the obesity and the built environment. Professor Lazarus, professor here, and I were on NEJAC together, right? And one of the things that I kept stressing, and he kept thinking I was a nut, was that what I wanted to do was to take the morbidity and mortality data that's broken down by race and class, and to analyze that as a way into environmental justice issues, right? That is, so rather than just looking, say, at siting decisions or the actual decisions that have the environmental impact, is look at what's actually affecting the communities, and then build backwards from the actual morbidity and mortality tables and ask what are the things that are causing the effects that we're observing when we look at this data. And then that would lead you to ask, well, how can we do SEPs? For example, how can a SEP be structured to supplementary environmental program? If you actually happen to prevail, how can a SEP be structured to address environmental justice issues, even if the main litigation was not environmental justice, right? So that let's start looking at the various tools we have. And the built environment is absolutely critical, right? So that one of the questions would be, you know, like the work we're doing in Advancement Project, right? Is when you look at a community, what are the prevalence of, say, liquor stores, convenience stores? What do those stores have on their shelves? Is it possible for kids to walk to school? If it's not possible for kids to walk to school, then the capacity of cities to provide safe ways for kids to walk to school ought to be a priority, ought to be an issue, right? Things that parks, and Robert will probably talk about this, the absence or presence of parkland and capacity for kids to be outside, right, in the built environment in cities is an EJ issue. It's an EJ issue, and we need to look at that, because we need to look at the health of our communities and take that as the, in my view, take that as the baseline, and then build up, right? And so it gives you a different. Once you take that approach, it gives you different places to intervene, right? And so some of it might be litigation, some of it might be policy advocacy, some of it might be, I'm not even sure what, right? Might be working with people who have the most impact on the built environment. So that there's that. The disclaimer. If I could have said, and any person has a private right of action, can have a private right of action arising out of this executive order, believe me, I would have done it, right? Having had to write briefs before I got to the Department of Justice, trying to, you know, craft a private right of action from this statute, from that statute, and, you know. So I don't know the history of it. All I know is it wasn't happening, right? So, but, you know, what can I say? You know, I don't. You know, it wasn't. You know, I don't know how it came to be, but it was largely viewed as an internal housekeeping mechanism. And the idea was, there's a long article written about it. The theory behind the executive order actually rose from my work with Joe Sachs, right? Because Joe Sachs, when NEPA was passed, was one of the most virulent opponents of NEPA, right? And he said anybody who thinks that NEPA is going to improve environmental decision making, you know, believes that you know, something like cars can run on coconut oil. Well, they probably can now, right? But at the point, you know, he said this is nutty, right? 20 years later, right? He wrote an essay saying, you know, I'm not as smart as I thought I was. Because what's happened is if you integrate these norms into the decision-making structure of agencies that have make decisions that affect the environment, they actually start to make better decisions for the environment. Maybe not the decision you'd like them to make, but a better decision. So the idea behind the executive order was what? Look, we're going to try to change the way agencies make decisions concerning environmental justice. And we're going to try to build that into the basic structure of their decision-making process. And it's a slow process, concededly. But the idea is we want it to be the normal way they go about their business, so that 25 years from now, somebody won't have to say, oh, I really care about environmental justice. It'll be the way they make decisions. That is, they won't be able to make a decision that affects the environment or environmental justice communities without taking that into account. That was the goal, right? We're not there yet, obviously, right? But that was the goal. And so that was why we structured the executive order the way we structured it, right? Because what we wanted to do was we wanted to change the decision-making process. Who asked the question about the National Petroleum Council, right? I was appointed to the National Petroleum Council. I'm no longer on it. I was appointed by Secretary Richardson for two reasons. One, he wanted to have a Latino on it, and two, he wanted to have a Democrat on it. I might have been a Democrat then. You know, what we were studying then is actually the stuff that's issued now. We were studying the fragility of the oil delivery system to cyber attacks. Right, this is what, 20-some years ago. You know, what did we do? I mean, basically we studied, you know, how the industry works. My chairman at the time was a fellow named Dick Cheney. You might have heard of him. It was a weird thing, I have to say. It was a weird thing. You know, I mean, whenever I would walk into meetings, I always felt like the person who didn't belong at that meeting, right? And I'm sure I was not the only one who felt that. So it was, I did it because the secretary asked me to do it. And I feel like I learned a lot, but it's not like it's really just, it really doesn't do anything. Right, okay. Who asked the question about Robinson Township? Right, and the carbon footprint, right? In fact, these are closely related, right? These are closely related because how many of you know about the atmospheric trust litigation? The atmospheric trust litigation, right? One of the articles that Lani mentioned that I wrote years ago is an article called "Who Owns the Sky?" Right? And the question that "Who Owns the Sky?" asks is, why should emissions trading schemes, for example, right, trade profits between people who are adding pollutants to the atmosphere? That is, my point was pretty plain. I mean, I'm a simple-minded kind of fella. The idea was that everybody who breathes has an interest in the atmosphere. A real interest, not just an interest in breathing to stay alive, right? That is, if you can convert that atmosphere into an asset that you're going to turn into cash, then everybody who breathes ought to be able to get a share of that asset once it's converted to cash. So if you're doing pollution trading between companies, right, and the goal is to reduce the carbon loading capacity, for example, of the atmosphere, and there's profits to be produced with, all of us, not the state, all of us, right, ought to share in that income, right? And then I propose creating individual development accounts in which this cash would go. Right? We can do this, individual trust accounts, right? And so the idea, and the Robinson Township, right, it constitutionalized the right to a clean environment, right? Joe Sachs rehabilitated and rediscovered the public trust doctrine, right? And so the public trust doctrine right now is currently being used to ask the question in all 50 states, soon to be internationally, in all 50 states at administrative and judicial level, doesn't each state have an obligation to do something about greenhouse gases? And they're using the remedy is something that never gets talked about in law school, but it's a remedy that Joe talked about. It's called legislative remand, right? And the idea is the courts can't tell the legislature what to do, but they can tell them they have to do something, right? And that means they can put it on the legislative agenda. And once it gets on the legislative agenda, then the people have a place to intervene, right? And the people can intervene in the administrative or the legislative process, and this is why community organizing matters, right? And this is one of the ways that litigation and community organizing fit together, right? And so yes, it actually is part of the concern. And the idea of environmental justice, broadly speaking, right, is about the carbon loading capacity, but it also raises issues like hotspot analysis, and you have to take hotspots seriously, and you have to analyze how you make accommodations for the hotspots that are going to be created if you make these trades, for example. Limitations. Who asked the question of limitations of law? I forgot. I mean, the answer, when was Brown decided? Brown against Board of Education?
54.
May 17, 1954, yeah, that seems like long ago, doesn't it? Well, the schools are more segregated now than they were when Brown was decided, right? So can you say that Brown was a failure, right? Or that we shouldn't have litigated Brown, or that we shouldn't have taken the issues of desegregation and race seriously? You wouldn't agree with that. Nobody would agree with it. But the answer is, it's not litigation alone. It's only by tying what happens in the courts to what happens outside of the courts, what happens in community groups, what happens when people organize, and tying the organization of people to the normative goals that are defined in litigation, that we can make law work. And that's, Lani and I are finishing a book about that idea. That is why social movements are critical for creating what we call durable legal change. And that without them, you can have victories that look like victories, but feel a lot like losses.
Right.
Okay. We're almost out of time. Oh, we had a question. That's right. I'm sorry.
Do you want to restate your question?
Yeah, so the question was, in your opinion, what is the environmental justice movement doing well, and how do you think
I think the environmental justice, one thing the environmental justice movement has done incredibly well and is really important is it's gotten people to focus on the distributive content of environmental decision making. That is, if you think about environmental or pollution as essentially burdens, then the question is, how are those burdens distributed is a question that's on the agenda now. The thing the environmental justice movement needs to do, right, is, because it's environmental justice movements are local movements, right, is that each of those local movements have to tie the outcome not just to the distributive implications of that particular decision, but then to network both with people in the mainstream environmental groups, but also other EJ groups, to say, look, this is about the distribution of environmental burdens across disenfranchised groups and across our culture, period. Right? So I think that's what they're doing great. I think that the building out the network is always an ongoing process, right? And tying the local, because EJ is a locally based movement, tying the local movements to national movements in a way that the executive order in some ways was an attempt to do. Right? But since it was just an internal housekeeping mechanism, it really wasn't directed at building the framework out for community groups to build those bridges that are then going to push federal and state agencies to actually do more, I think. So I guess that's a short answer to your question. Anyway.
So I have a question.
Okay.
Well, this is just an opportunity really to summarize what you've been saying, and that is with regard to other mainstream environmental groups, what's the role of environmental justice in that terrain where the boards in particular do not adequately represent people of color or environmental justice communities?
I could ask somebody from the audience to talk about that.
Hi, Charles Hamilton.
I would have called him Chuck, but he would have hit me.
That's all right. I'm an attorney in New York. I'm sitting next to a guy who has heard the same message at Darren Bell that I heard 40 years ago. And I'm on the board of the Environmental Defense Fund. And with my colleague, Peggy, from WEAC, we have been on the board for a number of times and have organized the framework for environmental justice with NEDF. And you know, it's interesting. You know, you can create a structure within a national environmental organization. There are about 20 or 30 of the big green groups, and I think in every group there is a sprinkling of people trying to do that at the governance level. Getting those organizations to execute programs and policies within that framework is a very different issue. And I think that what's interesting about the executive order was that for all the good that it has done, normatively and otherwise, setting a framework of philosophy around this, you know, it had a startling, chilling, and sobering effect on the large green group movement because they didn't know what to do with it, and in many cases still don't. Peggy Shepard and I just attended with you 2 months ago the second convening in 2 years of board members of color. It represents African Americans, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans who sit on the boards of national green groups, and we've started to really think about how, as a group, we ought to be together, bringing a collective weight of thought and opinion to those organizations and others about what is the significance of environmental justice. You can change a mission statement, you can change governance standards, you can do all sorts of things. But you know, it's interesting, major green group organizations in this country are not, they're not governments, they're not academies, they are not corporations with shareholders. And so the question is, ultimately, as you know, from working in the federal government and otherwise, that it's all about accountability. And who are major green groups accountable? Who are their stakeholders? And I will tell you, I think that for me, it's very simple. You know, you quoted Marion Wright Edelman, and she had that famous expression that you heard, which is that we don't have any permanent friends, we don't have any permanent enemies, we just have permanent issues. And the real question that continues to be on the table with major green groups and the environmental justice community is that we have major institutions in the not-for-profit world that take up over 50% of the resources that go into environmental matters. And then we have environmental, local community environmental groups that get very little of those resources. And there is a thought in this country that continues to govern the way people look at this thing, which is the old trickle-down theory. If the big groups have all the money and the resources, somehow that will all trickle down and change the things that happen in local communities. And it just isn't so.
Right.
And I think that until environmental justice becomes not something that's merely normative, but that is really a part of the way national green group organizations think about their mission, which is assisting local organizations to be in their efforts to come to the table, be part of decision making, and providing resources of all different sorts to do that without taking over local missions. Until that happens, frankly, we're going to be having this discussion every time a body like this convenes.
Yeah, one of the if you take the idea that was really did, this goes back to your question, right, that really did motivate the structure that the executive order took. And you know, I first met Peggy way back when the executive order was, you know, when I was in government. She didn't remember me until, but I was there. And the idea was you have to change the culture, right, of the way the green groups work, but you have to change the culture of the way the agencies do it. And so the idea of capture, right, you all, if you've studied law or, you know what the idea of capture is. You have to fight against that. One question you might ask yourself is why, and this is not a criticism. I'm going to want to soften it a little bit. But why did the Green Group spend $350 million trying to get Waxman-Markey passed, right? Trying to get action on climate change and end up with nothing, right? Well, there are a lot of answers to that question. My answer to it is because we thought we could still play an inside game. That is, the Green Group still thought they could play an inside game. And the only way you're going to change it is to play an outside game and an inside game. But the outside game matters, right? And that $350 million could have been as well spent in the communities, helping the communities to organize, as it was spent inside trying to change the minds of the legislators during the process. So, you know, that's a lot of money, or at least it is to me, right? And the question is, why did we end up with essentially nothing, right, with spending that money? If we had spent it organizing communities, the debate about what Congress ought to do on climate change and how it has an impact on real communities in this country, not just, you know, kind of like a global consequences, but real communities in this country. So you could tie some of the events that we've been witnessing over the last few years to inaction, and you could then support local groups to actually produce political change from the bottom up. And that's, I guess I would add that to what you said. Anyway, thank you all.
Thank you.
What were you going to say?
I was going to say thank you, Gerald.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was tremendous. It was great to be able to hear your views, so thank you so much for coming. We're honored.
She's saying thank you.
Say